Okay, today we are actually talking to a friend of mine, Amanda Connelly, and we're going to be talking about a really good topic regarding leadership development and leadership coaching with her today. So I'm excited. I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So with that, why don't you tell me a little bit about your business? Now, I know you work for an organization that I'm familiar with, but why don't you tell me a little bit about your story and how you got involved with the business, and just tell me kind of the backstory as to how you got involved with CMP.
Sure. So CMP, we've been around for about 22 years now. We've got three different practice areas. We've got outplacement, executive recruitment, and then we've got leadership development, which is my portion of the business. And so I get the honor of working with many executive coaching opportunities, training opportunities, leadership development, strategy, and many validated assessments, which I'm very fortunate to be doing what I love to do. So the way I got started is kind of interesting. I was an executive for Raising Cane's and Chicken Fingers many years ago.
I didn't know
And
that.
was. And Joe Frotcham actually was a consultant that came in and he assessed our executive team and really provided some wonderful insights and did several different sessions with us. And during one of my one-on-ones with Joe, he said, "What is it you're passionate about? What do you really want to do?" And I said, "Well, eventually I'll do what you do. That's really what I'm passionate about." I like really building leaders and working with individuals who are passionate about their own work and partnering with them. And I said, "But I really like, where I'm at right now. And so I'm going to stay here for a bit." And then I ended up leaving Cane's, went to CVS for a while. And Joe and I stayed in contact for that entire time period. And then when he purchased CMP, he asked if I wanted to come on board and lead the leadership development space. And so I jumped at the opportunity. And so It was really the right time, right place, right time. I think I'm very fortunate that I was able to have the time at CVS and at Cane's, and I needed that to be able to really learn and grow even more than I have. I've been in HR for over 20 years, and so I needed that extra time, and I'm glad I had it and joined CMP, and we'll never look back.
Okay. Wow, that is so cool. I didn't, I honestly didn't know that about you, Amanda. So this is kind of the fun part of having different guests on the show, because I get to know the person too. So
Yeah.
it just shows you also the power of networking. So it really
Yeah.
shows you how to stay connected. And it sounds like Joe did a really good job. He must have seen, that you had a really good, he had a good eye for talent, and he probably saw that you had some really nice, really good skills. So I'm glad he landed you. So that's the way that I got to meet you a few years ago. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm just going to jump in, because we are here, as you mentioned, you're the practice leader for leadership development and coaching. So I'd like you to start out with, because it's interesting, because our audience are kind of like middle market size companies. Typically, we try to share good content regarding leadership development for business owners, C-level executives. So from your, if you were going to go ahead and share a definition of leadership development for our audience, how would you encapsulate that in a couple of sentences?
Sure. Leadership development for me is a lot about that respectful challenging of one another. We weren't born to be leaders. We were born and we've learned over time through mentors, partnerships, individuals who really invested in us, allowing us to become the leaders that we are today, allowing us to really grow and become our authentic leadership self. And so to me, development from a leadership perspective is figuring out who you are as a leader, who you want to be. And then who do you want to be today might be different than who you want to be 5 years from now. And that's the wonderful thing about being human. We can evolve. Our brains are very malleable. And so we're able to really take on additional pieces of information, adjust, adapt, and evolve. And most importantly, cascade that to others. I think that we have a great deal of responsibility as leaders to others. I mean, if you think about the impact that we have, not only on their careers, but on their professional, personal lives as a whole. And so it's our role as leaders to make sure that we're investing in them being that whole person, that satisfied person, that if they're not happy with what they're doing, we challenge them We really need to get to the bottom of why are they doing what they are doing today? Are they in the right place? Is this the right time for them to start thinking about things differently? So that respectful challenging to me really matters. And oftentimes, the higher we move up in leadership, the more people avoid, right? Giving us that feedback. And so we miss out on that quite a bit. And I think that that's our role as leaders, to continue to invest in ourselves and develop ourselves and continue to grow. We're all a work in progress.
That's great. Now that is so interesting. And I look back at, I was in corporate America for about 23, 24 years and kind of rose up the ranks. And I think it is true that once you get to a certain place, you may find that you feel like, oh, well, I've mastered this because I rose to this level or this title and what have you. But it really is critical that even doesn't matter who you are, the place you sit at, whether you're a chief HR officer, head of sales, head of operations, investing in yourself, critical. Really continuing to look for ways to improve yourself is really, that's some great, those are some great words of advice right there.
Yeah, very important. I think it also becomes even more important if you think about it, because your span of control is greater. So your degree of influence is greater. So the investment in yourself and in others should continue to increase, not decrease. And being open to learning more. And I mean, if you just think of the world today, we're in a very different place than we were 5-10 years ago. So we've got to learn and evolve. Otherwise, the business is going to move forward without us. And we're not going to be leaders if we turn around and there's no one behind us, right? We're just standing alone.
That's so true. So what do you think about, so if you go in from a consulting perspective with CMP and that an organization of, I don't know, just for example purposes, an organization of 300 people have never done any leadership development programming or leadership development training itself, how would you start a process of actually starting to work with them or starting to explain why it's so critical and important for that company who has really done nothing around leadership development? What would you tell them about why it's so important to actually start that process as soon as possible?
That's a really good question, because that discovery is very important. Because if you don't have that buy-in at the top, then that sustainability may not be present. And so really it's that discovery piece of reminding them and showing them how the cost of not investing in their leaders is so great that we should not avoid that. If we avoid it, we're leaving money on the table every single day. So we can prove through CMP systems that there is an ROI to the training programs, to the coaching programs, to the assessments, the things that we do, there is an ROI. So I really talk more about if it's a financially driven individual, which typically those executives are going to be that. We talk about the financial side and the ROI and leaving money on the table. If it's someone who's, really that heartfelt kind of human capital piece, I want to talk about the people side of it. I do a blend of both. Let's share about the ROI really from that human perspective too, and what that cost is if we don't do that. So we talk through things, of course, retention, engagement, the type of candidates that are coming in, the type of leaders that are being built, and when the last time is that they've invested in themselves. And oftentimes it's a leader might read a book or two, but then it stops there. And I'm guilty of it myself. I read all the time. I'll get to the end of the book and I'm like, oh, that was really great. And I'll highlight a few things. And sometimes I go back to it, but often I don't unless I practice it. And so I really try to be mindful, and leadership development is about really being mindful, putting the spotlight on those things that matter to the organization and to those individuals. So it's really important, that discovery and that attachment to that mindset shift too.
So when you mentioned it a couple of times, I think, around ROI on leadership development. So can you just share for our audience, what is typically in the studies you've looked at, what would you say is a expected ROI back on leadership development? So they invested, I'll just throw out a number just for simplicity's sake. So if they invested $50,000 in leadership development and coaching, what kind of an ROI could that organization expect with, let's say, the next 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, there's a lot of different studies around that. Typically, what you want to see is that 30% of return really on what that investment is year one. And then it just continues to grow. Because if you think about, if you learn something new and you get a 30% return on that, you're passing it on to someone else, you're passing it to a team of 100. What is your return at that point, right? It's exponential. So it's really defining what matters, what type of investment do we want to make, and what type of return are we expecting back, and have it be very targeted around what it is that those expectations are, very defined metrics, success measures, things of that nature. And we're not one to come in and do kind of a fluffy session and then we leave. It's what do we really need to get to the bottom of? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit farther into our conversation today. But that's what's really important, is how is what you're learning going to stick and going to cascade into the rest of the team. There's nothing better than going into any of our clients and I hear their leaders saying things that I mentioned during a session, right? That start to become their own vernacular. There was a call that I had, a coaching call just before this, and she had a retreat with her own team and was starting to institute the models and things that she and I had spoken of. And so now her team's starting to speak the same language. So the more in times that you invest in your leaders, and it's kind of that repetitive, kind of really solidifying what that messaging is, the greater your ROI is going to be, because then it becomes a cultural shift in your organization. And at the end of the day, that's really what we're seeking. We don't want just that one leader to become stronger. We want that one leader to become stronger, which then makes our team stronger, which then makes our client retention higher, which then really helps just so many different facets of business. So that's really what we want to focus on when we think about ROI. It's not just what you get from that one session. And a lot of studies will look at that one session, and I say, look beyond that. It's really important to see what those cascading effects are going to be.
Right. Oh, no, that's wow. You packed a lot into what you just said too. So for companies that, going back to the example I mentioned previously, around companies that haven't done a lot of leadership development and coaching work, how would you, if you were going to break up the components of leadership development, for instance, pure like skills-based work, learning, let me just, I'll just pull a couple out, and you can, of course, correct me if I'm wrong or off base here. But if you're thinking about just around just being a good listener, effective communications, conflict resolution, handling change as a pure skills-based, how would you break down, if you were looking at a leadership strategy, how much of it would be truly skills-based training and observation, or maybe books and then reflecting on those, versus coaching, doing a 360 assessment and doing coaching work, versus the actual rubber meets the road, the application component, where that one manager you just got off a session actually did a retreat with her folks, and she was implementing some of the skills and some of the things you'd been working with her on. How would you if you were trying to bucketize that into different segments, how would you, if you can just put on some rough percentages of what would that look like?
So, I love assessments, validated assessments.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about that quite a bit. So I do like that to be a component of it. I believe that self-insight, when we see ourselves on paper, the aha moment is unbelievable. And what we see, because they'll say, well, I don't know if I believe this piece of it, or I don't know about, this component of this assessment, if I believe in it or not. And then we'll talk through, how does it apply at home? How does it apply at work? And then they're like, I do that. You're right. That is something that I do. That is something I need to change and I need to adjust. But to answer your question on those different components, which you mentioned, which are all wonderful and different things to tackle, it has to start with trust. And there's a Harvard Business Review study that's astounding, and I use it as a reference in some of my training, that 58% of employees will trust a stranger more than their boss. I find that to be so frightening, right? So if we don't start with trust building and really get to the bottom of, if we're not at that trust build stage, it doesn't matter if you're an effective listener, effective communicator, all those other items, because if you're missing trust, you're going to miss a huge piece of the impact of what that can have. So for me, the trust is, I'll start with 100% trust first. Then once we reach that, and then move into percentages around that self-insight, that assessment piece, understanding ourselves, understanding our team, understanding the impact of how we're wired, and different ways that we are wired today doesn't mean we have to stay that way. There's so many studies around neuroscience that show how we're able to replace behaviors. We can change those neuropathways. And so a lot of the training that we do isn't just about the skills-based piece that you mentioned, but it's practicing what behaviors are serving me well. What do I need to replace with other behaviors? And does my team even trust me? And if they don't trust me, I won't even move forward with a session effectively. So I really start with that trust building first and being very transparent and honest. So there's a lot of different exercises and things that we explore through that. And then the skills can come. But if you think about leaders, they should be spending just a fraction of their time on the how to do things, right? Being in the weeds, and most of their time around strategy, being more effective. What do I need to do? And so for leaders, we got to stick with that. And to be effective and build strong strategies and to have that buy-in, we have to have trust. It has to be there.
And that really is amazing when you mention that people will trust a stranger more than they do their 50.
Frightening.
That's just, it really is. And it just shows, well, it goes back to, typically the number 1 or 2 responses to why people leave a company.
Yes.
They leave. Sometimes it is monetarily driven, but in a lot of cases, it's because they don't have trust or respect for their manager.
That's right.
Their direct boss. So it's really fascinating. That I was telling a group last week about that too, and they were just, I think they were a little bit surprised. And that's why, the work that we do, we do a lot of, we do more foundational training for a lot of first line managers and supervisors, just because it's so, it doesn't matter how good the president or CEO is. At the end of the day, the person, they have the most interaction with their direct manager or direct team lead and supervisor. So that we've got to really treat, it's anybody who's in the human capital space as we are. I think we really have to be, it's got to be paramount that, making sure that you're it's almost like the sergeants, the sergeants and the lieutenants, making sure that your people who have the most connection with the employees are the ones that are actually, you've got to really, to me, you start there, because if they can't get it right and you can't focus on the C-level folks around strategy, then you're really going to be in a tough spot. So we're going to just take a short break now, Amanda. So we'll take a short break for about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll be back with Amanda Connelly from CMP and look forward to continuing our discussion there. So thanks so much.
You want to grow your business, but people issues are getting in the way. Managing the people side of your business is complex and can feel overwhelming. Does this sound familiar? At HR Catalyst, people strategy is our business. We create and implement a people strategy with you so you can get back to growing your business. HR Catalyst was founded in 2013 with the goal of bringing the best-in-class HR practices to small and middle market companies. We are your outsourced strategic people experts. We help you solve the people issues in your business that are slowing you down. If you have HR concerns, you can schedule a complimentary call on our website at hrcatalystconsulting.com.
Thanks very much for coming back, and thanks so much for Amanda Connelly for giving us some great insights around leadership development. This has been, I say this very sincerely, Amanda. Whenever I have a podcast guest on, I learn something new, and I've been in HR for over 30 years, so I think I know quite a bit. But it's always fun just to come back with somebody like yourself, and who's a subject matter expert in the field of leadership. So, prior to our break, we talked about leadership. We talked about 360 assessments. I think you referenced that. So for some of the audience members, they may have no idea what a 360 assessment is. So if you wouldn't mind just letting them know what it is and in what kind of a situation a company or leadership be using a 360 assessment from a developmental perspective.
Oh, absolutely. So a 360 really allows us to get insight into how others perceive us. So it's a bit different than other validated assessments where it's that self-insight based on questions that we are asked of ourselves about maybe behaviors and such. But this is perception management. And so a 360 will get information from your direct reports, your boss, your peers, your colleagues. It might be an internal or external colleague relationship that you want to really understand their perception of you. And so we're only as good as others think that we are sometimes in their eyes, right? To be successful, we've got to manage perception. And so to start with that, it's really understanding where others see us. And so a 360 gives a way for an anonymous tool to be given that information from each of those different rater groups. And many 360s have different competencies associated with the statements that the raters are responding to. So CMP actually has our own 360 because we were finding that some 360s out there didn't look at competencies such as emotional intelligence, which we deem to be extremely critical to the success of a leader. And so we developed our own. And so we have a 360 assessment that pulls in all that information from the different competencies. We're able to identify if there's a gap in my own self-rating than that of maybe one of these other rater groups. Then it tells me my direct reports might think I'm incredibly strong in emotional intelligence or communication, but it's my peer group that I really need to work on. I need to maybe change my communication style with that particular group. And then the open-ended comments provide us so much value because it's comments sometimes that people might not share with you face to face, but they're willing to do something in a more structured platform and provide the feedback that way. And so it really opens the door between the coach and the coachee, if they're in a coaching partnership with a 360, to really dive into, okay, let's talk about this peer group then. If we're wanting to work on communication, why might your communications look different with this group? What's happening? What do we need to maybe replace some behaviors around that? And then we do high volume 360s too. So an organization might reach out to CMP and say, I've got 300 employees. I want to have a 360 completed for them. And we're going to debrief those internally. So either option is provided, whether it's that support with a coach or internally. Some people have a strong HR team that might support that as well. But the main thing is to have a good structure around that 360, being able to provide that anonymous feedback, and then be able to look at competencies that really matter for the success of whether it's a leader or individual contributor, depending on the 360 that you select.
Right. Okay, great. That's a really nice overview. And I've used, we've used at the HR Catalyst, we've used 360 for a number of years, but it really is a powerful tool. So, how well, just switching gears a little bit, how well would you say, if you're going to just give it, let's say, a simple letter grade, like middle market size companies, let's say companies, $30 million, 500 employees, 30 million in revenue. How well would you say, in your experience, do those companies actually do leadership development? And if you're just going to use a simple letter grade, what would you say the grade in most cases they would receive?
Ooh, I'm a harsh grader. That's okay. Anyone. I would put it at a low D, honestly, in most cases. Yeah, I think, and it's not with malice. I think there's good intent with the way that they hope to develop their employees. But oftentimes that might be driven by someone read a great book, or heard something that they think, oh, you know what, my team could benefit from that. And then they dive right into whatever that is without the big discovery as to, is that what will be most impactful for your participant group? Is that something that you should be spending the time on as phase 1, or might that be a phase 3 or phase 4? And so I think really that discovery is sometimes tough to do if you're trying to do it internally about yourself without having that feedback from kind of a 360 sort of point of view, or from someone outside coming in and really looking under the hood, because we don't know what we don't know, right? And so being able to get that feedback from others is really important to say, if I invest in this, is that going to create the most value? And there have been times when we've had clients reach out to us and they'll say, we want a training session on X. And then we'll say, wonderful, we can customize that for you, or we've got off-the-shelf solutions, whatever might work best for you. But then we start to talk to those key stakeholders during the design phase, and they will tell us, that's not really what I need for my team. What I need is this. And so then we start to go down maybe a different path or a blended approach that's going to be able to tackle that. And of course, starting with trust each and every time, because the main thing is being effective. We're so busy. And so taking, another day or two out of our teams, we want to make sure that it's something that's going to have that impact for the organization and that hits home for them, because it's palatable, the change that can occur, the aha moments that occur when you bring people together and you start to create this culture of accountability and this coaching culture, if you will, we call it, when you bring these teams together. It's powerful. It really is. And so those sessions can really provide such great value if you're hitting on the right topic.
Wow. No, that's great. I know we could probably carry on for another half an hour just on what you just said there. So, but I do love that, the focus, it seemed like part of that whole foundation is around trust, because you think about over the years, and this, gosh, I'll probably date myself here, but I think going back to like Enron, going back to these classic, I worked for an organization, I guess I'll be polite and not use the name of the organization, where there was definitely some things that were unethical going on regarding financials and how the financials were recorded, that brought down the company. So that ultimately drove the company from being extremely successful to within about 3 or 4 years later, it actually went through bankruptcy. And this was a company that, had 100,000 employees. So I think it just shows you how many organizations now, just the trust level of a CEO, president of the organization, quite often, the trust level is something that a lot of employees there is a lot of mistrust, because there have been a lot of mistakes made there that are really not in the company's self-interest. So, yeah, interesting. So, so would you say, is leadership development, leadership coaching, is it a system? Is it a process? Is it a strategy? Is it all of the above, none of the above?
I would say it's all three of those, and also mindset. I would throw mindset in there, because if you don't have the adoption or acceptance of what you're attempting to change, nothing will change. People will go and they'll check the box of whatever it is that you're trying to present to them, and then they continue doing what they're doing. So that adoption and sustainability of whatever you're trying to develop in your leaders and in your team is extremely important. So without systemic processes, you're not going to be as effective, obviously, but also without that mindset. What kind of buy-in do I have? And have you done a good job with the discovery, all those pieces we've talked about? I would add that to that list as well.
That's great. So if you were going to say, if you're just going to give me, 3, what are keys to success within the system, the strategy, the process? And I kind of gave you, I make this a little tougher on you. And I just say, if you give me the top 3 in your opinion, what would that top 3 be?
I would say, don't leave money on the table. Make sure that you're talking through what are your goals. And if you're leaving money on the table today, which we all do, I mean, everyone's guilty of it. There are things that we could continue to improve upon. Make sure that you're focused on the right things to not leave that money on the table. I think that's number one. I think reminding our leaders too, their responsibility to mitigating the risk that exists in organizations, whether it is the mistrust, like you mentioned before, the lack of accountability, the lack of ownership. It's your responsibility as an owner of a company and really as a leader in any organization to mitigate those risks. You have a responsibility to the livelihood of every one of those employees, their families. That personal and professional impact that we have, again, as leaders is extraordinary. And so I feel like it's our role. I feel like we're not really holding up our end of the bargain, if you will, if we're not providing that process and that support and development for our individuals. So I think that mindset of that risk mitigation is also really important too. And I think also making sure that you've got a structure in place that has that proven ROI is really important. So I think if you miss the boat on that and you're really just going after whatever is the fancy new training program that's out there, I think you're also going to miss the boat there. So I think that that's probably the third component that's really important. Have a trusted partner helping you through that process to make sure that you're going to hit the mark and that you've got that adoption like we talked about earlier.
No, that's great. So, with the experience you have, Amanda, what can cause failure here? Failure in the leadership development. You start working with a client, you've had a really good relationship with them for, let's say, a newer client you've been working with for 6 to 12 months, and then all of a sudden you hit you hit a brick wall. What could actually cause that derailment, in your opinion?
That you weren't tackling the right things to begin with. And so, or you're moving forward too fast. And like I mentioned before, you might be working on something that they're not quite ready for yet because you haven't started with the trust building. There's a really interesting team performance model. I don't know if you've ever seen it with Drexler, and it really talks about where are you at in that high performance stage. Trust building's number 2. Goal clarification's number 3, and so forth. And if you meet with a team, they might think, you know what, we're already a high performing team. We're moving forward with X, Y, and Z processes. Then I meet with a team and I'll ask them on this model, where are we at? And they'll say, we're still at trust building, or we're still at goal for clarification. Or you might even have a member or 2 on the team that says, I'm trying to figure out if I'm even in the right place. Like, why am I here? I'm at phase 1. So even if you only have one person on your team that's there, you're not a high performing team, because it's kind of that cartoon, if you've seen it, where you've got the whole team kind of pulling one person up by a rope to try to get him up the hill. You're not an effective team in that moment, right? So it's walk together until you get to that hill. Make sure you've got a structure and a plan in place, and then you all move up the hill together. And then you're able to really reach that high performance. And oftentimes we miss the boat on that. We think if we've got a good idea, everybody's going to get on board with it. And that's not necessarily the case. So that self-assessment that we talked about before, that team assessment, perception assessment, all of that is really important to determine where are we now, and then where do we want to go, and then what's in between there. And so we can help with each of those 3 phases, but you can't go straight to phase 3 if you haven't even figured out phase 1. And oftentimes we try to do that. We're in a hurry.
Right. I think everybody is human nature is now, right? So we all want to, we live in a world of instant gratification. So, which is not a good place to be.
Oh, yes.
So for business owners that are listening to this, so business owners, a C-level executive, and they don't have, or, they don't have a leadership development program now whatsoever, or they have after hearing you, they're like, wow, we're really missing the boat here. We got to do something about it this year, the beginning of 2023. And so what would be the 3 reasons you would tell them you need to start doing this now and not continue to procrastinate regarding putting together a leadership development program?
Yeah, I would say first, give yourself grace. We all want to do what's best for our employees. I always try to assume good intent in every situation. So give yourself some grace to know that you've done the best you thought you were doing to this point. So even if I gave that terrible grade that I gave earlier, there's always time to recover. So you've got support out there. Take the time to really understand what's needed with your team. Find the right support partner to help you through that. And really starting with giving yourself some grace. It starts with identification, right? None of us know what we need to change until it's brought to our attention. Right. And so hopefully with your podcast, it's some individuals are having some aha moments where, yes, this is something I need to provide for my team. And then I need to find the right partner to figure out what it is I need to provide for the team. So I think that those are really important components of making sure that you're making that decision for the investment with leadership development.
Right. No, that's great. So perfect. Now, thank you so much for this, Amanda. This has been so insightful for me. Again, I honestly just, every time I do this, I find out something new about leadership, the topic you talked about, a little more about you too, just personally. So it's great. It's always exciting to do this. So any final thoughts on leadership development you wanted to share with our audience?
Ooh, there's so many, just some final ones. I would say really continue to invest in where you're passionate. if you find something that you're passionate about, that's going to really help drive you as a leader forward. There's so many times when I'll meet a leader and they're kind of in that state of burnout, especially now with everything that we've all been through as a society in the past several years with COVID and everything else. How do you need to shake it up to really move forward? So find a passion. And for me, I'm definitely a little bit nerdy. So I took an MIT course on neuroscience and had it really change neural pathways and replace behaviors and to help with coaching. And so find something that you're passionate about and really just hone in on that skill, hone in on changing, know that you're not stuck with whatever behaviors you have today. And just remember that the amount of influence and accountability that you have in a leadership position, and make sure that you're not falling short of what you would hope to be as a leader and what you would like to provide to others. Because if we all had that mindset of just giving back and learning and growing and developing, I mean, what a wonderful state we would be in if we could really influence others in that way and be that way ourselves.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So now we're going to have a little bit of fun with you. So, yeah. And it's, I think you mentioned a little bit ago, you mentioned that you're an avid reader. Yeah. So if you only had your top 3 business books you'd recommend to our audience, what are they?
I'll share some of the ones that I'm reading now. Some I'm reading for a second time, but there's so many out there. And again, it's got to be the one that really resonates with that individual. But there's one book I'm reading right now that I love, and it's Coach the Person, Not the Problem. And that really dives into, sometimes in coaching, you really hone in on what that individual wants to achieve versus what does this person want to achieve as a whole individual, and how do we need to move forward with that? And as leaders, I think we need to understand that with our team as well. So it goes beyond just a professional coach or executive coach like myself. It's also as a leader, how do I want to show up for others? How do I want to mentor others? And don't become a fix-it person. Make sure that you're guiding them through the process so that they're whole as well. That's one I'm reading. The other one, let's see, Just Listen. I'm reading that one as well, which is really interesting. It's a study around just how important it is for not just listening, but it's the validation component. And so they I don't want to spoiler alert on the book, but they did a research study, which is really interesting. And it talked about just the impact of validation in communications versus really just being a good listener. The days of just mirroring what you're hearing from another individual is not alone going to be able to kind of suffice any longer. You've got to really be able to kind of validate that individual that you're communicating with. So I thought that was fascinating. My other one is Man's Search for Meaning. You've probably read that. I've read it probably 3 times. I'm on my 3rd time right now, so I don't know what that says about this season of my life, probably because I'm an empty nester now. So really just trying to define what is next. Does it look different in this next season, right? So continuing to obviously build our team from a leadership development standpoint, but how do I want to challenge myself a little bit more? And so I thought reading that book again, dusting that little gem off would be helpful.
That's great.
It's a good one.
That is great. So, so let's see now, a couple more questions for you. So, podcasts, are you listening? I'm not sure if you're a podcast listener or not, but if you are, what are 2 podcasts that you're currently listening to?
So one that I like podcasts. I think they're fun, especially when you have guests on and you get different perspectives. And so there's 2. I'm going to do a shameless plug for CMP's podcast, American Narratives. It's really interesting because we bring on executives from all different walks of life with very just diverse backgrounds. And we get to hear kind of their trials or tribulations, what makes them successful, what makes them tick, and what we could pull from that experience, which I think is really important to be able to learn from. And then my fun one that I'm listening to now too, as well, is The Happiness Project. I don't know if you've ever listened to that one. It's really good. And so they talk a lot about these crazy things that we do to ourselves, like negative self-talk is one that just came up, and I coach on that quite a bit. And so, of course, that resonated with me, where we are sometimes our own worst enemies. And so how do we kind of work around that? And how do we build a happy life for ourselves with gratitude and grace and all of those things that we could all use a little bit more of in our lives? So they bring on some fun, just guest speakers, and it's a really interesting podcast. If you haven't listened to it, I actually think you would enjoy it.
Okay. No, I need to, I may listen to it tonight. So just because I know I love to, there's so much good content out there for podcasting. So no, that's a great one. So what would you tell your 16-year-old self today?
Ooh, I would tell my 16-year-old self to slow down. I've always been a very, very driven individual, started extremely young. And looking back at who I was when I was 16, I was just ready to grow up and be an adult and, work. And at the time, I thought I would be a dentist, actually. Little interesting fact I probably never shared with you. And so I was just on a really fast track to growing up. And I don't think I benefited from some of the more 16-year-old type things that I should have, because I was a 16-year-old living in a 40-year-old's body, but a 16-year-old body, 40-year-old's mind, I guess I should say. But I would have slowed down a little bit more. I would have taken joy in those kind of tiny little trivial moments a bit more. I try to do that today, but I'm still kind of that high-driven individual too today and moving forward. But taking those moments that really matter and spending the time to sit in it and just be grateful.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you live in such a beautiful part of the U.S. You live up there in the mountains of Northwest Arkansas. So it's last question, then we'll find out how people can connect with you. So 80s favorite 80s band.
It's still my guilty pleasure today. The Police.
You got to love the Police.
Sometimes you just have to go back to that good 80s music that was just kind of raw and kind of brings you back to those wonderful moments too of the 80s. It's just a good time. Yeah. So the Police is really a band that I could go back. I could still listen to them every day.
Yeah, they do. And sometimes I'll go on Spotify and listen to the Police or just I love Sting's voice too. Just kind of that very high. Whenever you hear Sting first measure or two, you can tell it's Sting just because he has such a unique vocal ability.
Yeah, he's got a very distinctive style. It's wonderful.
He does. So
the 80s though, in general, though, we just had good music back then.
I know.
Good
it's
style,
like, oh my
good
gosh.
music.
I know what happened to the music. I tell you, that's a whole different podcast I'll have to do with you later.
Yes.
So
it's
the decline in music in America. So with that, Amanda, so how can people get in touch with you with you and CMP? What are the best ways to connect with you and maybe carry on the conversation, or they want to find out more about the work that you do at CMP? How would they connect with you?
Oh, yes. I really look forward to the opportunity of connecting with your audience. And they can go to our website at careermp.com and be able to really check out all the wonderful things that we're doing in different lines of business. And you'll see my name on there, so you can reach out to me directly. I'd love to chat with you and learn more about your business and any struggles that your readers have or listeners have. I'd love to hear about that and connect with them too. Life's about making connections, right? To circle back to our very first conversation or point of conversation, it was the connection with Joe that led me to CMP. So you just never know, meeting the right person, what it can lead to. So I open up the opportunity to have discussions and connect with your listeners.
Right. Oh, no, that's great. Yeah. The connections now, I think so much of it is about having a good circle of people who are well-intentioned. I think you talked about, people that you can, and trust is really critical. So I think this is one key thing I really, really kind of resonated with me, is making sure from a leadership perspective, you have a leader that you can trust, because it is so critical, not only today, but it's timeless, that there's, you've got to have that kind of a relationship. So with that, Amanda Connelly at CMP, thank you so much for your time. This has been an awesome podcast. And if you want to learn more about 360 assessments and leadership development and coaching, please reach out to Amanda at the information she shared with you. And I look forward to our next podcast next month. Thanks so much. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.